This request for bill introductions. Do we have any requests? Yes, please step forward and state your name. Yes. I think you might, there's a little red button to.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
There we go. Perfect. Loud and
Okay.
clear.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman. My name is Wanda Brownlee Page. I represent the 35th District in Kansas City, Kansas. I would like to introduce RS 0887. It's an earning tax bill.
Okay. Thank you. Committee, are there any questions? Without objection, the request is approved.
Thank you.
Are there any other requests for bill introductions? All right, seeing none, I did want to take a moment and address committee. We have some minutes that Leah had sent out. Typically in tax committee, we've been under the process where the committee assistant will email those minutes out to you. If anybody responds with any corrections, she'll make those corrections, but then they're just adopted kind of by acclamation. And visiting with the reviser, it would probably be best if we actually took action on those into committee to show in the minutes that we've approved the minutes. So I believe you should have an email from Leah with the minutes from the 21st and 22nd and 27th. If you'll take time to review those, we will take action on approving those minutes tomorrow. This time, we'll go ahead and open up our hearing for the day, and that is House Bill 2038. And for a summary on that, I would turn to the revisor's office, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2038 would create the Kansas Film and Digital Media Production Development Act. This act would provide tax incentives for eligible projects produced in Kansas for the purpose of developing the film and the digital media industry in Kansas. The act would be administered by the Secretary of Commerce with the assistance of the Kansas Creative Arts Industries Commission, with projects being approved by the Secretary of Commerce. The act would commence on July 1, 2025, and no income tax credit or sales tax exemption would apply to production or post-production expenses made after 2034. Under this act, there would be an income tax credit component and both a sales tax credit component. The income tax credit would be for production companies based on a percentage of production expenditures in Kansas as approved by the Secretary of Commerce, and a sales tax exemption for production or post-production expenditures. Starting with the income tax credit for production companies, the income tax credit would apply for tax years 2025 through 2034 based on the amount of production or post-production expenditures made in Kansas by a production company that are approved by the Secretary of Commerce. The tax credit would be applied against the tax company's income tax liability in which the qualified expenditures were made, with a possible carry forward for the next succeeding years, but not to exceed the 10th succeeding year, so a 10-year carry forward. Credits are transferable under this bill. The claim is to be made within claim for the credit is to be made within 1 year of the date of the last eligible expenditure. The aggregate total amount of income tax credits allowed should not exceed $10 million in a tax year, with a 10% of the total amount would be designated for Kansas-based production companies. The maximum cumulative amount of all income tax credits awarded to a production company for a certified project for a taxable year shall not exceed 40% of the total qualified production expenditures or qualified post-production expenditures. And that prior to receipt of any income tax credit, the Secretary of Commerce shall examine the expenditures and any other evidence to be in compliance with the Act, and that the Secretary shall notify the production company and Secretary of Revenue to determine if the expenditures qualify or if there are any disqualifications. Moving on to the amount of the calculation of the credit would be a basic credit of 30% of the qualified production expenditures or the qualified post-production expenditures if there are no production expenditures. There are essentially 3 additional 5% credits. The first one would be for an amount up to 5% of qualified production expenditures for a multi-film deal, eligible television series, high-impact production, or contributions to film-related infrastructure or workforce development. A second credit amount up to 5% would be if 50% or more of the crew or above-line personnel are Kansas residents. And then there'd be a third up to 5% credit if the credit or if the project or a post-production company has previously received an income tax credit under this act with respect to a certified project. There's lastly another additional credit of up to 25% for a Kansas-based production company if at least $25,000 in qualified expenditures, including the production, is not intended for a multi-market distribution. Moving on to the sales tax exemption, there is a sales tax exemption for sales of tangible personal property or services that constitute production or post-production expenditures that are purchased for the purpose of a certified project, and sales tax exemption for the sale or installation of machinery and equipment and the construction, maintenance, repair, or modification of sets, props, or scenery or other facilities constituting production or post-production expenditures by such production company for use in the state for a certified project. Production companies would be required to obtain a exemption certificate, and any exemptions must be approved, and may be limited by the Secretary of Commerce. No sales tax exemption shall be granted after January 1 of 2035. Kind of the overall administration, the act requires a post-production company to essentially come into agreements with the state, providing evidence of adequate financing, general liability insurance, description of the project. They must come into an agreement with the Secretary of Commerce. They'd have to repay credits if the terms of the agreement or the requirements of this act are not met. And lastly, the Secretary of Commerce and with the Secretary of Revenue may adopt rules and regulations to implement the provisions of this act. And with that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you for that thorough description. Committee, are there any questions for the reviser? Oh, yes, Representative Helgerson.
Is this the same bill that we had last year?
I believe when the House Tax Committee heard this last year, there were additional components dealing with grants and awards and some distributions of money. Those provisions are not included. To be honest with you, I didn't look to see if the credits and the sales tax exemption were identical, but they are pretty much substantially similar, I would say.
Thank you.
Adam, toward the end, you had referenced some provisions to claw back if these credits were not applied properly, and maybe this is a question for Department of Revenue, but if those credits have been transferred, how does that process work? Is that spelled out in the bill, or is that something the department would have to?
I'd have to look into it if the department's not able to answer that fully.
Okay. Committee, any further questions for Mr. Siebers? Seeing none, thank you, Adam. At this time, we'll turn to Department of Revenue for an overview on the fiscal note.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, Kathleen Smith with the Department of Revenue. The Department of Revenue is estimating that House Bill 2038 would decrease state general fund revenues by $10 million in fiscal year 26 and each future fiscal year through fiscal year 2035. So that is the cap of $10 million that we used.
Was there any account for the sales tax exemption?
We're not able to estimate at this time. We don't know what the investment will be.
Sure, okay. And do you have a response to what I'd asked the reviser? If somebody had violated or kind of broken the terms of the agreement, how would you claw that back if those credits had been transferred or sold?
I would have to look at the bill more carefully, but I would assume we would probably go after the original investor.
Okay.
Or the original person that made the investment.
Okay.
But I'll have to go back and look. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, I understand. Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the 10 million is a maximum per year, correct?
Correct?
It wouldn't necessarily be that. It would depend on the number of approved projects.
That is correct. It would be based upon the expenditures that are actually made, yes.
But not to exceed 10 million.
That is correct.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Stogstill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just a little confused about the numbers. This is basically a brand-new industry in Kansas that they'd be bringing in. And they would actually be adding money to the Kansas economy because they would be getting tax breaks and so on like that. But when you look at what they bring in income tax, and they bring in at what they would be spending in restaurants and hotels and all of that sort of thing, we would still be gathering significant revenues into the state that we wouldn't have if that industry wasn't here. Isn't that correct?
Mr. Chairman, yes, sir, there would be other industries that would come in because of that, and yes, there would be additional investment that would be made. Our estimate does not account for that.
Okay. Thank you.
Further questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you, Kathleen. We will now open up the proponent section testimony and welcome first to committee Stuart Little.
Are we on? Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Stuart Little. I'm here, Little Government Relations, on behalf of organization Grow Kansas Film, to talk briefly about the film and digital media bill for this legislative session. And I'll just hit the highlights, and then there are a bunch of folks here who work in this business in Kansas, and they'll be able to shed some light on the issue. First thing I would note, and Representative Helgerson raised this issue, the contents of this bill are what passed the legislature at sine die last spring at the end of the 2024 session. It passed the House 102 to 22 and the Senate 32 to 5. This was in conference committee report, and it was sent to the governor along with another tax bill and two others, I believe. After sine die, governor vetoed all of them on principle, don't want to do one or the other. And then you all came back for the special session and came up with whatever number of tax package that was passed. So there was no chance to override. So this would have been law, but for the blanket veto of all of those tax bills that arrived at that specific point in time. So just to be clear, this has gone through the Senate 3 times and through the House 1 time, and it is essentially what was in the conference committee report, with the exception, as your revisor mentioned, some of those grant programs were taken out. So I just want to make that real clear. For those of you that are new to this committee or new to the legislature, this is essentially a 30% tax credit for a production that would either be a domestic, somebody in Kansas, or somebody coming from out of state who wanted to film a portion of all or some of a TV show or a movie or a documentary or something. 40 other states have film media tax credits, and so people pick where they want to film based on where they can mitigate some of their costs. That's how the market works. You have to go through an application. It's not for everybody. You go through an application process. You go through approval. You do your project. You do an audit. You go back to Commerce. Everything matches up. Then you receive your tax credit. And it is unlike some other economic incentives. It's not the money up front. You've got to spend the money before you can get that. I would note kind of why we're here and all these people here on the second page of my testimony, and I hope you all see it in color, and I hope it gets published in the internet in color. These are pictures taken from a film set in Scott City, north of Scott City at Duff's Ranch. This is a buffalo ranch out there, and there's a story behind these two pictures that kind of tells kind of why we're here. This is part of a probably between $5 and $10 million movie that's being shot in places in Kansas. And on this day, these 3 or 4 days out there, they were filming out north of Scott City. The people making the movie went to Oklahoma, film tax credits, 80 million of them in Oklahoma used up, so they don't have any. Arkansas, I think theirs is 25 million. all of the tax credits in Arkansas were used up. So this filmmaker says, I can't get the tax credits in the 2 places he want to go, but he's a Kansas resident. He says, if I'm going to spend my money and not any credits, I'm going to do it in Kansas. So they bring 75 to 100 people out north of Scott City. They have all of those trailers that you see, everything that's involved there, horses, drones, all kinds of things out there, shooting for 3 or 4 days. They spend, I think, 4 nights in Garden City. There's 100 of them. They're spending all that money, transportation, security, all those kind of costs, spending out there for 3 days. And I went around and looked at all of the license tags of every car there, and there were 31 vehicles there, and 7 of them had Kansas license tags, and the ones that didn't, I think, were craft service, bringing the food, and the wranglers of the horses. So that's a huge number of people that came into Kansas because they have both the craft and the technical expertise to do the work, and they all went back home. They spent a lot of money here, but they went back home. These people are going to talk about on the business side how they make decisions where to do this work. It is not an art talk. It is, in some ways. It's an industry that is creative and does all those kinds of things, but this is a business. And in all the other states that have this, they're competitive in this business and utilize what they can. And so I'm happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time, but these folks can talk you through the details of making these things.
Thank you. Committee, I think we've got 5 or 6 proponents. We'll take questions at the end. If you want to just make a note of questions if a specific conferee gets up. Next, I'd like to welcome Kiki Bush.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and members of the committee. My name is Kristen Bush, although most people call me by my nickname, Kiki. And 2 years ago, I had the honor of speaking in front of you in favor of film tax incentives. As a brief recap, I'm a professional actor who's been in over 50 films, television shows, and plays, including on HBO, NBC, and at the Lincoln Center. I've been directed by Oscar and Tony winners. I've acted with many household names, and Meryl Streep has praised my acting twice to my face. During the pandemic, I moved back to rural Kansas, where I met my writer husband and stayed to create a life together. Today, I'm going to give you the world's shortest crash course in independent film production, just in case you've never made a movie yourself. Here are the bare necessities. You'll need to raise a lot of money. You'll need actors, crew, equipment, locations, and you'll need businesses to help feed, house, and transport your cast and crew. Easy, right? Nah, not quite. But this is precisely what I did since moving back home. I raised tens of thousands of dollars, largely made up of small donations from rural Kansas women. I cast Kansas-born actors living in New York City and flew them home. I hired a crew. We shot on location at my family's horse ranch in rural Saline County. And I spent thousands of dollars on local hotels, Airbnbs, caterers, restaurants, grocery stores, and diners. Now, I didn't have Martin Scorsese's budget, but much of what I did have went straight back into the Saline County economy. Mercifully, the Kansas weather cooperated during our filming, and I now have a final cut of the game camera, which we showed in the Capitol Auditorium last week on Kansas Day. Now, some might say, well, she made a movie without incentives. And you're right, I did. Past tense. I can't afford to make another one without them. Some others might say, we don't need Hollywood here, they'll just go back to LA once filming is done. That's not true. For the last decade, the film industry has been decentralizing out of LA, and those fires last month will push more filmmakers out. With this exodus, it bears remembering that tax incentives are, by a long shot, the #1 reason for choosing film locations. I want to close by highlighting a dilemma that one of my hardest working crew members is facing. Isaiah Marcotte is a filmmaker, a young filmmaker in his own right from Salina, and he's grappling with the decision to stay in Kansas or to follow the work to other states. He told me, it's just so hard to stay here and make a living in my craft. It would be much easier to leave, but this is my home. I identify with this completely. Professionally, it would behoove me to move back to New York City, or to Atlanta, or Oklahoma City, or even to ks.gov, which, due to its tax incentives, scored big with the Hallmark movie A Chief's Love Story, which spent $1.5 million in ks.gov. That's one movie alone. Kansas does not make it easy for its creative young people to stay here. We're unwilling to staunch the creative brain drain by actively telling our kids that it's better for them to move away. Without incentives, they probably will. This is my home that I love, and I believe that our landscapes and our people's stories are worthy enough to compete with other states, that our stories are worthy enough to film. With your help, we can tell our own stories at home in Kansas. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Our next conferee is Justin Rohrbaugh.
Good job on that name. That one can be a tough one.
Wish I could take credit for it. I just welcome to the committee.
Chair Smith, members of the committee, thank you for allowing us to come and speak with you. I was here a couple years ago too. And so I'm here to give you a little bit of an update about what's happened. My name is Justin Rohrbaugh. I am the director of the School of Digital Arts at Wichita State University and Shocker Studios. We are the home of the Bachelor of Applied Arts and Media Arts, which was a degree that was created back in 2017. It was approved by the Board of Regents and we launched it 60 days after its creation. Our current production space is about 35,000 square feet, although because of we've experienced some growth, some very rapid growth. We are in the process of a renovation to be in what's, I think, going to be around 52,000 come next fall. Very exciting, but also kind of scary to see where these students going to go. When we originally started, the upper administration had tasked me with trying to get 65 students by year 5. My first year, I had 97. When I spoke here before, we were around 300 and some. Now we're over 550. Projections are that 4 years from now, we'll be over 1,000. Students are pouring into this program, and when they're done, they go where the work is, and unfortunately, that's not Kansas. Recently, we partnered with and formed a new private-public partnership with Justin McClure Creative in an entity that's called Synthetic Scenes. It's virtual production. It's an LED volume wall where I can put an actor anywhere in the world. And I can control the weather inside. We did a thing with dancers just a little while ago where it was snowing in the studio because of our snow machines and the things we're able to do. It's really great. And we're training these students on these amazing technologies. And my fear is that once they get trained up, they leave. There's nothing to keep them here. They go to where they can find the work. Wichita State prides itself on being the leaders in applied learning. And that's exactly what our program does in the media arts. I currently have 155 students in some type of practicum, which is a hands-on experience creating these types of things outside of the regular classroom. This year, I'll have, by the time we get through the end of the semester, I will have 80 graduates just this year. And I'd like to say that's 80 graduates that are staying in Kansas to work at the companies that are here, but they're not. In fact, that's probably one of the biggest things missing for my program is real life sets in Kansas that students can get on. We can get in small productions, but they don't know what it's like to walk onto a large set unless I take them somewhere. Recently, a former Wichita State graduate, Cowie Lim, reached out to me about, hey, what are you guys doing there? I'm hearing your name. She lives in Pasadena, California as an executive producer. She's from Wichita, graduated Wichita. Well, actually, she's from Malaysia originally, but she graduated from Wichita State, went out to LA, has become an executive producer. She's contacted us and has fired her LA-based company that does visual production, visual effects and all that, and has hired our students to do that work here in Wichita. She told me she'd like to do a lot more film work, but she can't. She's got to piecemeal it because of the lack of incentive here. And so the reason I've got her is because she wants to give back to where she graduated from. So probably the most heartbreaking thing I deal with is that mom and dad, that they come in and they say, my student wants to come here, they believe in this, they love this. Can they stay in Kansas? They're not. And that's what I got to tell mom and dad. I'm from Wyoming originally. I came to Kansas. I love it here. They don't get to stay, and it breaks my heart. If we can pass this legislation again, it turns that answer into a yes. So I'm hopeful that we can get this past that finish line again, and we can start keeping some of that talent in Kansas instead of sending it away. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Next, we have our second Justin. Justin, I'll probably butcher this one. Begnod?
No D, beg no.
Begno, all right. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, good afternoon. My name is Justin Begno. I'm a Kansas resident. I'm also a film and television and digital media producer. Now, what does a producer do? As a producer, I help find projects and adapt books, articles, and other stories, and I make them into feature films or television shows. I help bring those projects to life. I also hire the actors. I hire the crew, such as the director, the camera person, the lighting crew, the set building crew, the costume designers, hair and makeup artists, wardrobe, grips, gaffers, and anyone else on set. I also hire the editor, the colorist, the sound designer, the motion graphic artists, the animators, the sound mixers, visual effects professionals, and I hire vendors for food, for beverages, for catering, for truck rentals, car rentals, heavy equipment, such as cherry pickers, cranes, forklifts, other construction workers. And I help book hotels, make travel arrangements, and plan other events. It's a lot. A producer is also instrumental in finding the location to make the movie or television series. This can be a warehouse, a soundstage, someone's home, a small business, like a coffee shop, a flower shop. It can also be an exterior location like the Great Flint Hills, Dodge City, St. Mary's, Division Ranch, or Cottonwood Falls, or somewhere in the western prairies in the state of Kansas. Another instrumental component of the producer is to find the money. This can be in the form of private investors, grants, gifts in kinds, bank loans against distribution contracts, and tax incentives. These last two are key to what a producer really does. Finds the location, finds the money. Many times these are one and the same. Finding a location with a tax incentive is a win-win for the producer. Kansas does not have any form of tax incentive, and because of this, our beautiful state, gorgeous locations, and hardworking crews have simply been overlooked, a flyover. I was born and raised in Kansas City, and when I graduated high school and wanted to pursue a college degree and a career in film and television, I had to leave this region. I'm actually firsthand example of what Mr. Rohrbaugh was just talking about. There was nothing here for me. After I graduated college, I moved to New York City, not back home to Kansas, because NBC, the History Channel, MTV Networks, Tribeca Film Institute, all of which are places I worked in my young career, were all in New York, not in Kansas. Later, I moved to Los Angeles. I worked for Universal Pictures and produced films for Netflix, MGM, Fox Searchlight, and a few others. I worked for a completion bond company called Film Finances and later a film tax credit lender called Grosvenor Park. I used to write contracts and write loans against tax credits. I can talk about that later. I've worked on dozens of television series, and I've worked on over 400 feature films. I've made movies in 30 different states here in the United States and close to 20 different countries around the world, but not one in Kansas. Why? 0 tax incentives. I'm now a proud Kansas resident. I recently moved back here with my family. And I now know why. I now know we have a growing crew base. We have top quality vendors, some of the best service industry providers that I've seen or worked with, but sadly not the one tool I know from experience will work. Kansas has never been part of any of these conversations, and I'm here today to help change that. There's never been a better time to provide an incentive to film in Kansas. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Our last conferee is Sean Rhodes. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, committee. Good job on the name. That was a lot easier. I'm Sean Rhodes. I'm originally from Heston, Kansas. I now live in Wichita. I'm the new Director of Digital Services for Restore Studios US, based in Wichita, a division of underground vaults and storages in Hutchinson, Kansas. We were founded in 1959 by local Kansas families and still owned by local Kansas families. And we continue to expand our capability in and around the media and entertainment industry. Recently, UVNS purchased Restore Studios, an award-winning film restoration company from London, England, to support our film and media clients in the United Kingdom and the United States. So to give you some perspective, UVNS has 50 acres equaling over 100 football fields, size vaults, 650 feet underground in the Hutchison salt mine, of which many of these vaults are full of millions of motion picture films and commercial television programs, as well as archival video, audio, and historical assets. Our clients are among the biggest names in the entertainment business. My job is to duplicate the London Restore operations at the highest quality levels, scan the film at resolutions of 4K to 13K, and restore, color correct, and preserve the film for the next generations. If you don't do this, the film turns to vinegar and disintegrates, and we lose that information forever. In the last few months, UVNS has made a significant investment in the state-of-the-art film digitization and preservation lab in Wichita, with an enormous task ahead of us, and the volume of film we are responsible for. We need to greatly scale our operation by offering internships and hiring qualified people. We have an interest in supporting the bill to encourage the filmmaking infrastructure here in Kansas, and our plan is to further expand our services to help the film industry grow and develop in our state. As a longtime independent filmmaker myself, I recently won the Emmy Award for Best Historical Documentary. I am personally invested in making this happen for the community of filmmakers and businesses in Wichita and the state of Kansas. It will be a winning situation for everyone involved. For the last 15 years, I have been very involved with productions of film and television coming to our state. The first question they answer me when I get on the phone with them is, do you have tax incentives in the state of Kansas? I say, unfortunately, no. Click. That's the end of the conversation. They won't even talk to me anymore because they're going to go to a state that has tax incentives. If we do not have the tax incentives in place, the business of filmmaking will go to another state. If they go to another state, so will the money. If film productions get a percentage of the tax dollars that they spend in Kansas back, the state will directly benefit by collecting tax money that would otherwise be spent in another state. That includes the money the film industry will be spending on hiring our local crews who pay income taxes. The filmmakers from outside of the state will be frequenting our restaurants, hotels, grocery stores, security, laundry, other shops, and the list goes on and on. Cowtown in Wichita will be booked every day of the year, profiting from the filming of popular westerns. Our Shocker Studios and other colleges here in the state would not have to leave, their students would not have to leave to go to another state to get a job. This is all just the tip of the iceberg. If the state gives back 30% of the qualified tax revenue collected from the filmmakers, the state of Kansas will keep 70% of the funds collected. 70% of zero funds collected equals zero. Without this bill passing, we will be at a disadvantage to our surrounding states. Allow us filmmakers to have a level playing field so that we might compete with our skills and talent instead of forcing us to leave to get a job in another state working our craft. We can build this money-making industry right here in Kansas, and it will benefit everyone in the state of Kansas. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. That is all the proponents that I have listed. We have a number of written only. Is there anyone else that was wishing to appear before the committee as a proponent? Seeing none, we will go ahead and take questions. Okay. Who you first? Okay. Start off with questions. Representative Sawyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question's for Stuart Little. It's a 58-page bill, so I've been trying to go through it. You said it was identical to the bill or not identical, but pretty much identical to the bill we passed in the conference committee report in 2097. Is that what you said?
It's not identical, but the contents are the same. The provisions are saying they may be moved around a little bit, I noticed, but yeah.
Okay, well, I have a couple of questions. One is, I remember the House bill we heard in last session, 2182, the tax credit, the income tax credit was refundable. In here, it appears it is not. It looks like it's non-refundable, but it has a, if I'm reading this right, a carry forward for 10 years and you can transfer it once. Is that?
So the original bill had transferability and refundability. The bill that eventually is in the, that was passed in the conference committee report, and the Senate took out both of those and just did carry forward, and then we had conversations about the carry forward tax credit is like not having a tax credit essentially because these folks don't have a tax liability that they need to necessarily cover most of the time. What ended up in the conference, that ended up in the conference committee report is the transferability. And that's what, unless I'm mistaken, it has transferability in there. And that's the refundability, I think, raised enough issues with folks that the transferability was more, and that may have been something at conference committee time that was discussed and worked out there.
The one other thing I want to make sure I understand too, I believe both the sales tax exemption and the income tax credit are set to sunset in 2035 in this bill.
All the provisions are of the whole program, yes, sir.
All right, thank you.
Representative Clayton.
The previous representative asked the same question I had.
Representative Shu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Apologies to any committee members who actually have asked this question before, but just to kind of dream a little bit, let's assume this program goes in, it's successful, puts us on a level playing field with kind of our competitors in the region. What does the film industry that is burgeoning in Kansas look like to you guys? What are our advantages compared to our region maybe? Where maybe does it make sense for there to be a hub for this? Just kind of dreaming a little bit.
I'll jump up. Okay, I got it. So we were talking a little bit ago about Westerns, and that a lot of Westerns, when they go to film those, they used to do a lot of filming of Westerns in Croatia. Wouldn't it be cool to have Westerns filmed in Dodge City and to actually have them be more historically accurate? I think that's part of what we see is changing, is that we're taking advantage of the beauty of our state and making it more applicable and telling Kansas stories. The Wizard of Oz was not filmed in Kansas. And so I think when we can have that opportunity to bring those things to our state and to have the growing workforce to do those things, it provides a new industry that's just new for us to experience and to appreciate. Does that? Cool.
Did you want to?
I can throw in something too.
Do it, man.
So recently I had a filmmaker friend of mine from Austria working on a separate project come here to Kansas, and we took him to Cowtown, and there were a couple senators there as well. It turned into a larger meeting than we were expecting. I was just going to show him Cowtown. And he could not believe what he was seeing. It's a completely authentic set with everything period piece from within inside these buildings. And so we started looking at some of the Kansas history books and looking how other cultures, like from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had moved here, Germans had moved here, Swedes had moved here, everybody else was moving here. It was truly a melting pot. And so we started looking at the Kansas historical books. He took this project back to Austria last fall. I think it was in October, maybe early November. And we started writing some stuff up, and we got an initial approval from a production company based in Prague and New York City for doing an 8-part series here, shooting it around Cowtown and in Kansas for a $3 million per episode budget, of which $2 million was already approved. That's how we start. That's one way.
Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, one other thing. I appreciate the question because it speaks to more the breadth of what this bill is about as well in terms of digital media and those kind of things. I would note in the written testimony, there's testimony from Joshua Wexler from Pure Imagination Studios. I would check that out. They are a gaming digital service. They do lots, you'll pull up their website and you'll see the variety of work that they do. They are investing along with K-State Salina in development there and that touches and gets into a lot of the more technical gaming, VR kinds of things that Justin's educating kids to do. And that is both part of, I think, an expression of the economics of this, why this isn't just a creative arts issue, it's an economic issue, but also that's a whole new field where everybody's recalibrating where they're going to be physically when you don't have to be anywhere. And we will be nowhere if we're not part of that. But he's kind of starting some of that there, if that makes sense.
Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I noted in the written opponent testimony that a 40-state study entitled Lights, Camera, But No Action is quoted in the opponent's testimony. And a quote from that study, results suggested that most of the incentives included under these programs have little or no sustained impact on employment or wage growth. I would like for any of you to comment on that study if you're familiar with it, or with that concept that it's going to virtually have no positive economic impact for Kansas.
You guys gonna let me do this? Okay. Okay. I appreciate the question. Thank you. That's something that we've addressed every time we've been working through the process. The reality is, and I think something to keep in mind is that the state is making a $10 million tax credit, and the state of Kansas is not going to get $10 million back. It's a tax credit to bring in $30 million of work. And so the tax credit's not going to be one-for-one backfilled into the state, but what you're going to do is you're going to have 20 million more, 30 million that's spent in your communities. They're going to be paying some of it back in terms of employment taxes and you know, the sales taxes on things that they're buying as they're housing and moving everybody around. So lots of folks that say this doesn't have a rate of return and doesn't have any impact are talking about the revenue is the state doesn't make it all back up, and that's not the point. You have to come in and spend all the money, and the tax credit is the incentive. I think what's happening in other states, where Oklahoma just went from $30 to $80 million, where who's at $1 billion? Somebody's at $1 billion. New Mexico's at $1 billion tax credit. And if you go around there, there's a whole industry. It's going to take a long time. I don't know that Kansas is ever going to become New Mexico, but it is. It creates jobs. It creates employment. You can see when people come into the state, like I showed you in the one film, people are having business livelihoods in other places because there's business and there's work there. They come here to do it sometimes, but they're not here all the time. So I don't know if anybody else is.
A few years ago, there was a reporting, it might have been 2022, there was $66 billion spent on movie productions. So there has to be a way to create create jobs and have a ripple effect, not just paying actors and directors and producers. It touches just about every industry. Think of it as a manufacturing type job, because we're manufacturing something. You're building something from the ground up that didn't exist before. The difference between, Pillsbury on your shelf at the grocery store and what I do is I got George Clooney on my box, and you might have on the Pillsbury Doughboy. That would be the similar thing there. I produced a movie in Georgia. It was $40 million for Netflix. $10 million came back to me. But the $40 million that was spent there we had 300 people on set. they were all getting paid. Those were all labor jobs, crew, extras, supporting staff, everything. We set up offices. We rented old warehouses to film because there were no studios to use. We used two old warehouses outside of Atlanta. All those people had to be fed. We had to transport them. They had to stay in a hotel, or we did long-term housing. This was over 6 months. So the impact is greater than what we're talking about here. It touches just about every industry: food industry, clothing industry, residential industries, rental car industries. I mean, it impacts everybody. It's got a big ripple effect across the industry. That's all I have.
May I add something?
Yeah.
To that end, I also think that there's the hearts and minds aspect of this. As someone who's lived in New York City for 10 years, London for 2, 3, I mean, I've lived in a lot of places, always wanted to come back home. And I have dear friends who are like, what are you going to do back in Kansas? And I think there's a part of me that gets pretty prickly, because when I drive back to Salina, to the Salina area, I think it is beautiful. And I think that our tourism could really benefit from this as well. I think we've got a lot to offer. And I think sometimes Kansas has a way of being a bit hangdog. Oh, we're just Kansas. We're really humble. Believe me, I learned this from my parents, to be humble about things. But I think it's time that we join the almost 40 other states and say, you know what? That study might have been out there, but there's so much else that comes back when we invest in film and television, et cetera. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to jump in the queue here. My prerogative as chairman. Representative Turner is next. But Mr. Little, you said something talking about New Mexico and Oklahoma. I think you said Oklahoma went from 30 to 80. New Mexico is almost $1 billion or more. At one point, I'm assuming no state had any tax credit. And then somebody came along and said, hey, we want to incentivize this in our state. So the first film tax credit was born.
Right.
Now we have 40 states. Kansas is jumping in. I guess my point is, I'm not trying to be negative here, but at what point does this stop? This is at $10 million, it's kind of small potatoes. The next step here is, well, we've got this in Kansas, but we're not competitive. We need to bump it up to 20, 25, 50. I mean, when everybody else is doing it, we're constantly giving away incentives, and I'm just curious at what point does this stop? Are we just continuing to give away until we get up to $1 billion that we're trying to incentivize?
I would note a couple of things, and my peers can back me up or correct me. In states, it's fair to say, in some states, you'll see some states have a tax credit, and then they'll get rid of it, and it'll go away, and then they'll come back and have it. Missouri, that's exactly what they did. They had it for a while, it went away, and they bring it back again. So it comes and goes. It has been a long time around, since the 70s. I think, was it Louisiana, maybe one of the early first ones that got started doing this. We're in a different time here in some ways. A couple of things I would note. It's the confluence of streaming services, the changing in the media, the changing in the television movie, COVID, the dynamics of, I'll find the nice, living on the East and West Coast compared to the Midwest and the cost of living there. All of those things kind of transpired, and that's why you're getting a lot of this development happening now, and why being in the mix is valuable and pays back when it doesn't have to be $1 billion. So you think of a place like Georgia, which I think they're $2 or $3 billion, and there's massive amounts of studio space there, and that's huge, and they're making massive investments. And at some point, if anybody's driven through Atlanta, there are going to be certain people that are like, maybe there's a change here where one wants to move. So you have the demand for more content in different services, different payers, different creators, all those kind of things. You've got gaming coming in. You've got virtual reality. You've got the business applications of virtual reality and those kind of things, all coming up within the last 10 years. And then COVID, where people say, well, I don't want to live on the East Coast anymore. I don't want to live on the West Coast anymore. People want to go where the cost of living, frankly, the cost of labor, where the cost of all those things are different. That's part of a whole bunch of things happening. And you don't have to spend $1 billion to do it. And you don't have to spend $100 million or even 50. If we had a $10 million tax credit, it would be used up, because part of what's happening, and this is all these insiders will tell you this, nobody's making, very few, unless you're in the Marvel universe, something that's over $200 million. There are many, many films in that $5 to $10 to $15 million range that are being made, and they're not, and Hallmark turns them out, and they're at the, they're in that $3 to $5 million market. And so there's a lot of folks that aren't taking risks on some big action movie that will utilize these things exactly. And some of them are local homegrown people here in Kansas who will make movies, but it's also people, seriously, when this passed before the governor signed it last year, I got calls from people all over the country who said, what do we need to do to apply for a film tax credit? And I said, well, we're getting it set up. And then, several weeks later, the bill's vetoed. So we're not going to offer something that no one wants. And if we do, you're not going to pay $10 million out. If that makes sense. Is that in general?
I want to throw something in there on that with the question you asked too. So this is a big business. This is a big money-making business. We don't have it here in Kansas. The reason why Oklahoma upped their tax credits to $80 million, and I believe theirs is also 35% that their tax incentives are. Well, take that, if that's 1/3, take that times 3. That's how much revenue that they're generating in. And they're just still kicking back 30%. But that means I'm terrible at math, 80 million times 3, right?
Representative Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess this is for Stuart Little also. I didn't know Representative Sanders and Smith were going to jump ahead of me, but yeah, same thing. I mean, I looked also, I saw the opponent testimony out there that points to a study. I did a little bit of Googling and came up with the Tax Foundation, who also says in the last decade, state governments have enacted numerous movie production incentives, including tax credits for film production, and they failed to live up to their promises to encourage economic growth overall and to raise tax revenue. So, with us being, because it's been in testimony that we're one of 10 or 12 states that haven't done this yet, it seems like there would be a big body of success stories to share. And when I look through testimonies, whether it be yours or any of the others, they're long on, it's like talking to friends about stocks. They've got their winners they always tell you about, but they don't tell you the bigger picture of how they've performed. Is there a similar study that's shown that these things have been very beneficial to states, or I'm just not seeing that in any of the testimony? Thank you.
I think the Tax Foundation study, I think, is that folks in the business, if it's the one from a few years ago, familiar with that, and that gets into, I'll come back, and not to just go back to the same answer, but the idea that the return to the state is, some of the 7%, 12%, 15%, that's the return that the state is getting. And that may be what they're collecting in sales tax and in employment taxes and things within the productions. And if that is what you look at, that's the conclusion that can be drawn. But what you're not looking at is how those resources or how the funding is spent within a community. And that's where the economic impact is on supporting all the various sundry requirements to make some kind of a production. I can understand part of the fluidity of this in some ways is that there are states that move back and forth in terms of what they do. And some of it has to do with politics. Sometimes it has to do with revenue. Sometimes it has to do with getting burned on some project. That's the nature of how it works. But it is, or of how it's been experienced. I understand that, I acknowledge that. But as a whole, it continues to be what states are embracing because they see the impact of it. And might not be an impact on our rate of return as a state, but they can look around and see all the people that are employed. If you go through Albuquerque and you see the studios and those kind of things around where people are working, there is an economic impact. It may not show up one-to-one on an economic analysis, but if anything, these people are capitalists and they're making money and they figure out how to do it. And so if it didn't work, they wouldn't be asking for more of them as far as I'm concerned. So.
Can I follow up? So, like here in the state, we might do a legislative post-audit on a particular program or something. Is there anything like that you could point to that's been done that might counter some of this information?
The last post-audit I saw, I believe, was from the state of New York within the last 2 years, I believe. And I think their analysis, again, was based on the impact on the state revenue. And that doesn't take into consideration the investment that's made everywhere. If you're strictly looking at what is our rate of return on $10 million, that's going to be a different number than $30 million that's spent in the community. And I think New York was the last one that I remember seeing. One from Massachusetts may have been another one too. So there are folks that are looking at it, and some folks choose not to do it, but most of them are still, or raise questions, but they're all still doing it.
Representative Stogstill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This for Mr. Rohrbaugh. If I could have him come up for a second. Kansas is losing a lot of children to go elsewhere after they've graduated from college and so on. I know we have a tremendous program in animation at Johnson County Community College. We've got industry programs that would support your industry at KU, at K-State, at Wichita, at Emporia, all over. And could you speak? I think we may have shot over this. The impact the economic impact those kids could make if they stayed in the state of Kansas. These are good paying jobs from what I understand in a lot of these industries and so on. And we need to find ways to keep our kids here and get them jobs that pay well, and they don't pay tax credits, they pay income tax and sales tax and property taxes.
Sure, absolutely. The first thing that comes to mind is we just landed, there's a company that's UK-based called Block Digital. And Block Digital is coming to Wichita, Kansas right now. They're opening up an office. And what they do is a lot of work with animation, visualization, game design, and some of those things that is paired with business. And so one of their big clients is Rolls-Royce Jets. And so getting students, if I'm graduating 80 students a year that are leaving, over a 10-year period, we're talking about 800 individuals, highly skilled talent that are going to go and make upwards of $100,000 to $150,000 in other areas in annual income. And so a lot of it's going to depend on the type of where they live. But in a short period of time, we're going to have a lot of people that are very skilled that are leaving, that not only, when we talk about business, not only does this translate to what we do with the entertainment industry, but I've got people talk to me about how do we do this type of visualization in healthcare, to where we're using elements of virtual reality and the same tools and the techniques that these students are training in, because they're coming to me saying, your students can do these amazing things, but we're losing them. But could we hire them in this ancillary thing? And ultimately, they've got to be able to sell the student on that to come and do that. But there are a lot of ancillary industries that can benefit from that type of skill development, that skill set. So I think that the hemorrhaging of that brain drain that we talk about, them leaving, plays a significant role in that. So any numbers or anything I would give you would be pure speculation because I don't know. But I do know that they're very high-paying jobs in the industry, depending on what you do. And a lot of it's going to depend on where you live. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Smith?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Anybody that just feels comfortable with this question, we're asking a lot of our agencies to look at their budgets maybe and cut their budget 7.5%. And then we're looking at giving you a tax break. You know, the revenue in Kansas right now is a little low. We're okay, but it's a little low. And we might cut some nonprofit organizations from being tax-free. I like what you're saying. I really have liked what you're saying, but do we have to do it for 10 years? Can we do it for 2 years and see if it works, or 3 years and see if it works? But when you say 10 years, it's hard for me to look at our agencies and ask for cuts and yet give you that. So if somebody would answer that, please. Thank you.
I can answer it from a very simple point of view. Of all of these people here, I'm the small potato. So my short film from start to finish took 2 years. It's still going. My husband and I dreamed up the idea about, 3 years ago. It took us a year to find the crew, etc. The point I'm trying to make is film productions take a lot of time. And if you see that, this one ends in 2 years, then I think a lot of people won't be interested. I think the 10-year, from my perspective, makes a lot of sense. It's not too long, but it definitely shows these bigger investors, they've got it until this amount of time. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Just one more thing to add. It's a relatively new industry, so Rome wasn't built in a day, right? So it's going to take more than 2 years to grow the industry and really, because this isn't just for Hollywood to come here and make movies, or New York, or it's for independent filmmakers too. And so the residents and the filmmakers here in the state of Kansas, that are still in college, it might be 2 years, it might be 5 years, it might be 10 years. I think it's going to take some time to grow this and make it into a robust industry.
Representative Corbett?
Thank you, Chairman. And for me to hear this, it's kind of like the rest of us. If you live here, you don't realize kind of what you got because you see it every day. But I can tell you, when people come here from all other parts of the country, Kansas is an outstanding destination. And I think the more it's seen, the better it is. I don't know how to get there, but I've heard that as long as I've been in business. People come here, they're amazed. First of all, they don't realize it's like Dodge City. It doesn't look like the Wizard of Oz. It's pretty cool. So you got to think about that before you just cut it off.
Committee, any further questions? Seeing none, I do not show any opponent or neutral testimony to appear before the committee. Is there anyone wishing to appear as either neutral or opponent? Seeing none, I will direct the committee's attention to our written testimony on opponent testimony and neutral. But with that, we will close the hearing. And committee, that concludes our business for the day. We are adjourned.